So up until now we have been talking about the response of our filter to a step input. The green line, the low pass step response, and the yellow line is the high pass step response, and they're complementary. If you start reading about this topic, you will hear the term impulse response more often than step response. So I'm trying to give you an idea of what an impulse response is. First of all, what is an impulse? As you can see in this column here, our input is a step. It goes from 0 to 1, makes a step, we look at the response. But let's just, for shits and giggles, imagine that instead of giving it a step input, we're giving it an impulse, which means as soon as time 0 passes, we give it a 1, and then from that moment on, it's all going to be back to 0. So the impulse, the input to our system is all zeros, then comes a 1, and then comes all zeros. It's just an impulse. This one little click, that's all we're giving the filter. That's essentially the atom of inputs. Like it's the smallest possible input that we can give it, the smallest quantity of an input. So the response to that input is quite interesting. So let's zoom in a little bit. You see that the response to that impulse on the low pass side is a little step up, in this case whatever our adoption rate was, and from that moment on it decays down to 0. And when I say down to 0, I mean towards 0. And that means it will never really reach 0. Like if I look at the numbers here, look at that, it's 0.0113, and then further down the road it's 0.00011, and then it's to the -5 to the -6, so these are exponents. So that response to that impulse is, if you look at it exactly, it's an infinite impulse response. So that's why these filters, in this case for the low pass filter, they are called an IIR filter, in case you ever run across that acronym. It stands for Infinite Impulse Response. That means the response to an impulse is infinite. It'll never really get to 0. It'll appear as if it's 0, but it never really is. The same for the high pass filter. You see that's all zeros, then it jumps up to, well, almost 1. It's not quite 1, it's 1 minus the adoption rate. And then it drops back down to a value below 0. Well, it wants to make the change of the impulse is from 1 to 0, that's -1. So it'll follow along, boom, down here, and then just gradually drift back to 0 because there's no change, and the high pass value will drift back to 0. And it's the same for the high pass filter. That response is going to be infinite. Look at this column here. It goes to, well, -0.0, many more zeros, and then there's these to the -7, to the -8. So the response of the high pass filter will also be infinite. That's why these filters are called an infinite impulse response filter, IIR filter. If you have a response curve that eventually reaches 0 and is intentionally, well, coded in a way to be at 0 after a certain number of frames, a simple moving average, for example, would be a finite impulse response filter. So after a finite amount of time, the response is just no longer there. So I'm sure you ask yourself, like, why in the world would I tell you about impulse response when I've been talking about step response? Well, to create an awareness that what I showed you before, the step input, is essentially just a number of impulses in a row, like one after the other. Think of an impulse, like this is one impulse, and then the signal goes back to 0. But the moment it does, there comes another impulse, this one, and then this impulse and this impulse. So a step from 0 to 1 is essentially nothing but a number of impulses in a row. And each of these impulses has a response, infinite impulse response. And if I add up all these impulses, they eventually add up to that green graph here. So the green graph only comes into existence because all these previous impulses in superposition, they're all still there. And that's what I mean when I say some information is contained in the signal. Like at this point, all the information of all previous impulses is contained in the signal. And if you add all these impulse responses up, they will add up to this green line. So I'm not going to keep talking about the impulse response. You will read about it if you want to read deeper into the topic. The step response is what we will be looking at. It makes much more sense in the context of motion cueing, and there's an equal principle at work. So take a look at this. So here's our random signal that we have filtered low pass and then created a high pass. Take a look at that signal, the blue line, the initial random signal. Every step that the signal makes, for example, this step from here up to here, that step will always be contained in the signal. The next step from here to here, that will also be contained in the signal. This step will not nullify the previous step. So in a way you can think of a signal just as a series of steps. You might as well think of a signal as a series of impulses, but you just as well might consider it as a series of steps. And every step is still present. Step up from here to here, it's still there. Step down, it's still there. Well, there's a pretty small step up and a bigger step down. All these steps are still in the signal. Of course, the sum of all steps from here, for example, to here are almost zero. But doesn't mean they're not there. The step response to all these individual steps are there, and they will be contained in the output signal. It's just that the sum of all these steps might add up to be zero. Like, for example, when that low pass filter green graph passes the zero, that means the step response of all previous steps add up to zero. But the information is still there in the signal. I think I should better say the sum of all the previous information is still in the signal. But for now and the foreseeable future, we will be just talking about the step response, because I think it makes much more sense in the context of motion cueing to consider the signal that comes in as making a step. It's just a bit easier to imagine, to get an intuitive understanding of what your response is supposed to look like. If you want to give the occupant on the platform a certain feeling, if you want to show them a certain acceleration or to show them a certain motion cue,